Hi, I'm Jeremy Hunter, and welcome to Untaught Essentials. For this episode, we're exploring the topic of grief and grieving. It's a follow-on to our earlier conversation with Mirabai Bush about death and dying. And after that conversation, I realized that that topic was about one's own death and dying. And then we started to receive questions about, well, what happens when it's other people around me who are dying? And how do I deal with the experience of grief and being left behind? And so Mirabai generously agreed to come back and have a follow-up conversation. And in this conversation, she talks about her own experience of dealing with her old friend Ram Dass's death, and who, as you know from the first episode, was her longtime friend and collaborator, and who had just published a book together with him, on the topic of death and dying. So sit back. I hope you find that it's a useful episode for you. I've received really wonderful feedback from it so far, and so take it away. Thanks a lot. So hi, Mirabai. Thanks for coming back.
Hi, Jeremy. I'm happy, always happy to be with you.
Well, likewise. So I thought, our last conversation focused on death and dying, and in the days since we made that, it occurred to me that there's also the flip side of the story, which, the last conversation focused really on one's own death and dying, and that there's also an important story about other people's death and dying, and what happens when you're the one that is being left, and how do you deal with the fact that somebody in your life is no longer there, and how do you work through the grieving process, or even learn how to do that, because it's, the many things that we're never taught how to do in school, This is kind of high on the list. Part of it comes from a conversation I had with a client who had two people die recently, and because of COVID. And she said she and her husband haven't discussed it, and it's almost as if we're pretending it didn't happen. And then other people having the experience of having many people die, and then also being responsible for managing the aftermath of all of that. And death is not something we talk about in this culture, and oftentimes do our best to avoid and pretend is not happening and won't ever happen, as we talked about last time. But I thought it might be good to kind of check back and have a complimentary conversation about when others around you die and the grieving process and all of that. So what is grief, at some level?
Well, grief is the inner dimension of loss, what we feel when we lose someone or something. And it's a good question, Jeremy. And I'm glad you came back with that, because this time of the pandemic is a time of all kinds of grief. As you said before, that anyone in leadership is likely to have a number of people who are in their domain that are going through losses, and it's not always definitely not always easy in the workplace. Just divert for a moment and say that right after 9/11, or like some months after 9/11, I was leading a meditation retreat for lawyers. And at some point, a woman said, I'm so happy to be here. My brother was killed in the towers on 9/11, and I have not been able to, or have not told anyone in the practice I'm part of. Imagine, and she was a very smart, very kind of emotionally awake person, but she felt like she couldn't bring it into any kind of professional setting. And so during this time of the coronavirus, just about everybody is grieving something. Either, friends or loved ones who've died or suffered with coronavirus, not being able to see people you love. It's so hard for me. I have my divine granddaughter who's 10 years old. And, I'm missing, a year or most of a year of her life. And she's going through a lot of changes, of course, partly because of the coronavirus. And I've seen her a couple of times. And when I do, it's not like it was before where I'm so intimately connected to her. There's a gap that we have to overcome. So we're grieving people in our lives. And there's something called anticipatory grief, which is grief for what we thought was going to happen. We thought all kinds of things were going to happen during these 6 months and in the time to come. And though many of those things are not going to happen. I had all kinds of travel and teaching and consulting, set up. And, little by little, I began to get, none of that is going to happen. People have, all kinds of difficult things that are going to come in their lives, many of them because of financial shifts and changes. And so when we have that kind of grief, it's real. We're grieving for something that never happened, but we had the anticipation and the idea that was part of motivating us going forward into the future. And now that's not going to happen. And it's that can create real sadness itself. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just had a conversation this morning with somebody who, that their parents are selling their childhood home. And then another person who, can see that her grandparents are getting older. And, that's another kind of anticipatory grief, something that
exactly.
We know that's going to happen. And we don't really want it to happen,
Yeah. And we're going through it at a time when everyone is going through difficult things. And so I found that the few times I am with people except on Zoom, but even there, we have a garden and people can, friends can come and sit 6 feet apart from us and have conversations. So we've done that a number of times. But I find that the environment is so difficult that I don't want to, talk about my grief and my sadness. And, I'd like to kind of, we're together. Let's, celebrate.
Yeah, right. In these rare moments.
Yeah. There are all kinds of changes that have gone on during this time but grief is a really important part of it. And it's so important to pay attention to and to go through as consciously as possible. Because if you don't, it just gets repressed. And later, anything can happen. Later, another person dies or is gone, and the grief becomes, intensified because you've never really processed this. And also grief leads us to transform this profound sadness we feel into acceptance and love. And if you don't do that, eventually when you come through the grieving process, then you're just there with that person who's gone, and you can just love them in a different form and hold it. But if you don't let the grief take its own time, then you don't get to that place, and you never get to relax into the love that you felt for this person. Because if you didn't love the person, you wouldn't be feeling grief. It's about love in whatever form. Sometimes there's a kind of dependence or but whatever form it's taken, essentially it's love.
Can you say more about the grieving process itself and how somebody might want to engage that? How do you open to that? And especially when the feelings can seem so overwhelming and it might seem so bleak. And what do you do?
Well, first of all, it's different for everybody and it's unpredictable. The amount of time that it takes, the way in which it manifests. You may experience grief and then it may seem to be over, and then out of nowhere it seems, it's back. So the first thing is to know that it's really different with each person, and to just allow it to take its course. To be with it is, the best thing is to see what's arising, to just be with it. And I know you've been teaching various practices of being in the present moment. That's it, just being here now with whatever is arising and noticing what's arising. And because if you don't look at it and accept it, it's not like you want to feel sad, but you are feeling sad. So, or whatever you're feeling. So to just accept that, see it, and then let it pass. Try to notice if you're saying, feeling terrible about it. Oh, this shouldn't be happening. Oh, I don't want this to happen. Oh, this is really terrible. It's never going to end. Whatever your mind comes up with. Noticing that and just letting it go and coming back to whatever's arising in the grief. And it's so often surprising. As you know, my dear friend who I wrote the book on dying with, Ram Dass, he died last December. And we'd spent the 2 years or so before that writing about dying and grieving. And so I was really prepared for him to die. And he died as he wanted to, and it was peaceful, and it was time. And so when he died, I felt, of course I felt sad, but I felt so prepared for it that it wasn't, it didn't even feel like grieving. It felt like, the kind of moving into the next stage that, he wasn't there anymore. And, and I spent a lot of time during that period in various memorials for him, which often, that's another thing that people often go through. If we're talking about someone who's died, that, the funeral and the relatives and everything that goes on around dying. And then later, it comes. And so this happened to me just a couple of weeks ago. I was feeling down about something, about some coronavirus related issue, just maybe a kind of loneliness, or I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was just not feeling great. And I was sitting in the garden and just feeling that. And all of a sudden I felt this huge wave of sadness. Just, it was like a wave. It felt like, in the ocean, like being taken with it or taken over by it. And I just felt so sad. And I realized what came to me was that, Ram Dass, where are you? I felt like he always knew. I was feeling this sadness and negative energy and trying to figure out what it was. And what came was that he always knew. He knew, you know, and uh, and he was gone, and it took me so by surprise, and it was, and you know, it lasted for, I don't know, I felt that way for an hour or two, just sad, but you know, then it passed, and it all passes. So knowing that is really helpful while
Mm.
you're in it, and, you know, um, yeah.
Yeah, that it's that the wave is there, and that the wave will, not to resist the wave, right? It's
Yeah,
not your enemy. It's just
exactly.
experiences happening.
Yeah, yeah.
I often tell my students, look, you know, at the end of the day, it's just sensations in your body, right?
Yeah.
And it's nothing to be afraid of, even though we're afraid the wave is going to take us off somewhere and we're never going to go back, and
Yeah.
or never be able to get back to shore. And that rarely ever happens, if ever happens. But it certainly seems like that's what could
Hmm.
happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so important to know that. Of course, you have to be careful when you tell people that, because it's like, not this, you know, oh, it's
Right.
just going to pass. It's all impermanent and it will be gone. Not this. This is too deep and too big. And even if it is eventually going to pass, it's not passed yet. And I feel really awful.
Right.
So, um, having, I mean, cultivating compassion for others is really important around any time that others are suffering. But at this time, to call on that, and to, you know, to remember the times when you have been in grief, you know,
Mm.
and you know, try to call to mind how that did feel, and to bring that kind of caring, empathic concern to the other person. Usually you can't do anything for another person who's grieving, but you can let them know that you're there, and that it is an essential human experience. Every human, I think, experiences grief in their lifetime. And although it's different for everybody, that it is something we all have to go through, and to be there as another human who's, you know, knows that experience, and appreciates how hard it is in the other person, is really the kind of the only thing to do. And I think when you are in a work situation, or any kind of situation where you are in a leadership position and other people are going through various forms of grief, I think just letting people know that you understand that, yeah, we're all human and we all go through this. And this is a particularly hard time. And so many of you are probably experiencing different kinds of grief. And, um, you know, just kind of give support and space for that. You can't be a therapist, you know, but you want to acknowledge that this is a hard time, and that we do go through this, and we should all be aware of that in each other, I think.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of points, a lot of different threads I want to pull right now. But one is, you know, what I uh, oftentimes tell my students, you know, that even after a little bit of practice, they feel like they're now an authority.
Yeah, yes,
And
yes.
so I always, you know, and tell myself too, you know, don't be a mindful asshole, right?
Yes,
Like
that's a
just
good
spout
one.
some bumper sticker thing saying, you know, it's all going to,
Yeah,
all impermanent, right? You know, like as
right.
it's that easy, right? And so, and the other, it makes me think about what leaders themselves have to do to take care of themselves, to be in that emotional space, and how now we are in the, you know, we're approaching fall of 2020, and we've had spring and summer, and now we're moving into fall of this situation. And what I'm noticing is people are burning out because
Yes.
they're you know, treating a marathon like a sprint in some way, or
Yeah.
there's just so much going on. And how do you as much as I find the phrase self-care to be kind of barfy at some level, but really, taking that seriously, that every sustainably successful person I know has had some systematic support system they have created for themselves, which involves people outside of their primary relationship. That your spouse cannot be the repository for all your emotional stuff. And that, especially if you're in a leadership position, you're used to taking care of all these responsibilities, and it is not a sign of weakness to have a team that's there to take care of you so you can do this job well. And I think in 20 years of observing everybody who's successful in the way that you would want to be successful, they have a life that you admire and would want for yourself, perhaps, has a team, basically. And they're not shy about the fact they have a team. And in the midst of all that, not to stop feeling themselves. That's what one of the risks of burnout is, that you lose the capacity to step in the experience of others.
I'm seeing it now there's so many people involved in various forms of activism now, Black Lives Matter, politics, to or issues around healthcare. And it's interesting in groups of people who before, thought, self-care was for weak people or something, and then it was selfish, because look, if you spend this time on yourself, you can't be out there, changing the world. That, even in these groups of people now, they're recognizing that, self-care, there isn't really a better phrase hasn't come up for that, but I think self-compassion, but self-care is really so important. And I mean, the idea of a team is great, so you're not resting it all on one person, including your spouse. And I remember that, I've been doing these practices for years, but I remember when Obama was president, and I was trying to get myself to go to the gym every day. And there were days when I thought, basically I didn't want to go. So I told myself, much too busy today. I can't possibly do that. And then I would, I remembered that, like, Obama was the president of the United States, and he was actually acting as the president of the United States. And he would go to the gym every morning before he started, It was really helpful. And I think that if Mirabai, if he can find time, surely you can. And so I think that now more people are speaking out about this, and then we can, and leaders certainly can do it, and do that and share with other people some of what they're doing to take care of themselves so that they can care for others. And
reset expectations, that this is what a leader does, and I think that the other thing that I've been seeing too is, how do you relate to your own emotions? I mean, kind of given what rewinding to what we talked a little bit earlier about grief, but I think the dominant mode is to stuff your emotions and look tough and stiff upper lip and keep on walking, but that has some pretty serious consequences downstream.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this woman lawyer who, just broke down at the retreat because she didn't feel like she could share the most important thing in her life that happened in a public setting. So it seemed to me like, oh gosh, anybody would be, would be sympathetic about that, but she didn't feel she could do it, so it was stuffed. And then of course when there was a space, it came pouring out. But that we just acknowledge each other's humanity, And with that comes, if you treat yourself better as a human, you're going to be able to do your work better and to care for others better. And without that regeneration, and some of that regeneration comes from doing practices that, help you see how to let go of things, help you see your own limitations in the best sense. This is who I am, and this is what I can offer. By coming back over and over to whatever practice is grounding for you and helps you remember who you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, and the idea of regeneration implies a circle, right, and a cycle. And when I work with people on change, one of the things we talk about early on is, switching your view of time from a straight line where you're constantly moving forward into a cyclical view of time where, there's a maturation process, a dying process, and a regeneration process, and that's more like how the real world works.
How I like to think of it is that there is this linear time that's just, it's a straight line. And then the circle of the cycle of regeneration, the cycle of who we are, rolls along that line, and where they touch is the present moment.
Say more about that. That's interesting.
Just that in this moment that's all we've got, and it brings together everything of who we are, and as we're moving through time, and and of course we project into the future, and we use what we've learned from the past, but coming back to the present moment and knowing this is where we are at this very point right now is that regenerates the energy and insight in ourselves in order to keep on rolling,
And thinking about what you're talking about earlier in terms of say anticipatory grief, how much energy we use in a way that isn't really helpful right now.
That was a helpful concept for me to absorb, because before that I thought, how could I possibly be grieving that? It just didn't happen. But in fact, we do. And we also grieve. Most things we grieve don't happen just in a moment. Like when a person is dying is a good example. That, you're beginning to grieve through the process of them dying. But I remember that my mother, who had lung cancer, was unable to speak at a certain point. And our relationship had always been talking about things, and once we couldn't talk anymore, there's a way when you're silent together, it can be deeper, but there was a real loss between us when we couldn't talk. And so it was almost as if part of her, I was grieving that part of her that died before she actually, wasn't breathing anymore. And so in a lot of different kinds of experiences, we're grieving as we go along. It's not always a moment, that starts it.
Because I don't want to sound like a downer, but right, loss is always happening, right, at some level, and that it's as we spoke about in the last conversation, which I thought was really helpful. I mean, it was such a profound and simple insight that death is always happening, right? And it's always happened. There isn't anybody in history that hasn't died, and yet we resist it so much, and it's such a strange but also human, oh so human thing, And the fellow this morning talking about the loss of his childhood home, and then the young woman I also spoke with today, talking about, her parents had moved away from her childhood home, and the grandparents were thinking about moving to a assisted living facility, and moving away from their home, and how much space, the loss of space and the loss of, is so tied with our identity and memory, you know, and how our memories and values and experiences are tied up in places, you know, is such a, you know, such an interesting thing. And
it is, yeah.
I have to say, one of the dominant experiences of going to Japan is almost always some bit of sadness, because one of your favorite places is now a parking lot, and it routinely happens, you know. And you know, there's this beautiful little old house you liked walking past, and you know, somebody died and they couldn't afford it and they sold it, and now it's a parking lot. And that happens so much. And
Yeah.
you know, it's and that understanding that you know, one thing my students I talk a lot about are, you know, difficult emotions aren't problems to be solved, right? Like grieving is not a problem to be solved,
Exactly.
right? Emotions are there to be felt.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, in your description of, you know, experiencing this wave of sadness, well, first of all, you're such a great teacher in that you don't give the lesson, you describe the experience. That's such a wonderful way of doing it. And that especially I find people who are achievement oriented, right, and are used to solving problems as their dominant mode of being in the world, and realizing this is not a problem to be solved, right? That it's an experience to be had, and that's a very different kind of mode of being in the world than we're usually taught in school.
Yes, it is. And it's the practice of the basic mindfulness practice of noticing your breath, and then noticing it's all changing all the time, and just seeing thoughts arise and emotions arise, and just seeing them and letting them go. That practice of letting go, sometimes it seems really boring, or like, why am I doing this? It's not very important. Is the act of being able to let go gracefully, and without attachment, that's central to all these things we're talking about. You know, your childhood home, it's so heartbreaking for most people. And unless you had a really bad childhood,
and then you're glad
yeah,
you burned that place down earlier.
But the ability to just see it and see your sadness around it, and then just let it go. It doesn't mean, when you're grieving a person or even your home, that you are not caring about it, and you're not going to forget about it. It's going to live within you as a memory for sure. But what's important, what was important about it, is not going away. What you learned from being in a place that you considered, safe and caring, and place where you grew and were with people who took care of you, and all of that has affected you. That's become who you are. So it can't be taken away. But letting go of, of like thoughts and emotions as they arrive is such an important practice. And then, of course, when you die, that becomes, Ram just like to say that dying is just another moment. And of course it is. There is you're alive, and you're alive, and you're alive, and then one moment you're going to die. So if you're there in the moment, just being there with it for whatever arises, just like silly thoughts that come up when you're doing mindfulness, then it arises, you let it go, and you're on the other side, whatever that means. We don't know.
That's interesting, huh? Yeah, the insight to the dying process itself, right, is something that's, where do we ever talk about that? But, and then let alone to help guide people through that process, right?
Yeah. And we don't, I think I might have told you, but I was giving a talk one time at the local assisted living or
Mm.
nursing care place. And about 50 people came. I think everybody who lived there came. And
Mm.
they all wanted to talk. You know, I did a reading and then they talked. And somebody said, you know, this is so great. We never talk about death and dying. And they were all, the youngest person was 70, you know, and they were probably from 70 to 90. And, you know, and I thought, if not here, where? You
Where?
know, and if not now, when? You know,
Yeah.
it was. I mean, I know this about our culture, but seeing all these people in the room say that was pretty stunning. Yeah. So we don't, and but we can also see if we can come to terms with dying, if we can let go of our fear about dying, then we can better meet things like the coronavirus, like, you know, losing friends, but also just losing the life we thought we were going to be having during this time. Um, uh, it makes it never that easy, but, you know, it moves you toward an ease with just letting go of what it was you wanted and recognizing this is what's here right now. You can still work toward a future, which is more, you know, has more to do with the way you want it to be, of course. But this is the way it is right now in this moment.
And how do I have the wherewithal to see what are the opportunities there, despite the fact I may be enraged by the fact that my thought for my life or the view of my life is not the way it was going to turn out. You know?
Well, usually the rage gets in the way of seeing clearly into opportunities. I
Yeah.
really there've been you were part of doing a study on creativity and contemplative practices, that the more you're able to be in the moment without the distractions of negative emotions and even just other thoughts, the more you can see what is in this moment. And that gives you like more possibilities, more creative possibilities. So actually, if you really want to change it for the future, giving up these, you know, giving up or allowing to let yourself, allowing yourself to let go of the emotions of grieving is what's going to let you see it. And which is letting go. It's not that by any means the grieving is bad. It's not. It's just that you see it. You know, one of the Zen teachers said something like, when these emotions arise, you welcome. They come to the door. You welcome them. You just don't ask them in for tea.
Mm-hmm.
Just say hello. I see who you are.
You are, right?
You may leave now.
Yeah, the something I thought about earlier, right? The one thing that was really helpful for me to know was that grieving comes in waves, you know, and that the wave can come up in times you least expect it. But
Mm-hmm.
understand that when that's happening, you're not regressing into some, you know, failure, but rather it's just the next wave of how the mind processes things. Because if you probably had to do it all at once, you'd go nuts. And so it kind of, it's like Netflix, right? It releases them bit by bit, so you don't binge grieve, right? And yeah, you know,
yeah, and there is a syndrome of feeling guilty about grieving, and that when you thought you were finished and now it's back, and you know you didn't do it right, or you shouldn't be doing it.
Mm.
None of that is true. It, you know, it will arise in its own space and time, and you know, just being with it is the best, and letting it go is the best you can do. There's no, as I said, you know, it's essentially human process that we have to go through. I mean, I didn't think I was going to feel that about Ramdas. I said, come on, we spent 2 years talking about dying together, everything we could think of about dying. And then he died this really good death. And I thought I was clear, and then this big wave came. So we don't know. We don't know.
So good
And
to know you're still human.
Humility around that is good.
Right. Yeah. Right. Even with all the, which speaks to the futility of trying to avoid our own emotional reactions, right? And that you can't at some level.
It is really helpful in grief to have human connection. That's why we have memorial services and funerals, and people bring, casseroles. And it just reminds me, as you know, my husband is much younger than I am, 16 years. And so we always assume I'll die first, But, and then EJ always gets really sad when we talk about it. And then our friend Sunanda said, EJ, don't you worry about a thing. Those casseroles are going to come flying through the door with women right behind them. So I said, with casseroles and dying. But being with other people is what, this is hard to process. And so sharing and talking is good. And that's one of the additional difficulties of this time is because not everybody is willing to talk about, really deep, sensitive things on Zoom or on the phone. And, it's when we're together that we usually are used to sharing these things. And it's harder now. And we just have to know that, so it may take longer.
Yeah, the formality of Zoom kind of creates some pressure, right? Everything has to be meaningful when, it's like, being a parent, all the really meaningful stuff happens in the moments that are kind of walking between the car and the store in the parking lot, or right before you go to bed or something like that.
And we all know we love those moments when the kids of whoever we're on Zoom with come rushing into the room,
Right.
because it relieves us of every moment being so important. Yeah,
that's great. Well, thank you for sharing this moment again, and it was profound as always and helpful. So I hope that any last advice you might have or suggestions you might have, especially thinking about how this is really creating a kind of new playbook for leaders, because our, I think, standard definition of professionalism does not necessarily include emotions. And I think you're finding, at least I've found, that the organizations that have made space for that and talk about it have been the ones that have adapted the best to it.
Yeah, and that was true after 9/11. Many people reported. And I would urge you and others who are in this situation now, which is unprecedented, basically, since, except for like the Middle Ages, but I don't think they had leadership so worked out then. but to write about it, really reflect on it, really see that this is a challenge. It's not just irritating. This is major, and to think about it, to write about it, and to share it with others, because we need each other in this, because it is all new, and it's a great opportunity to, you're thrust into this whole new situation. There's like amazing things to be learned always. So I would say, pay attention, learn, and share it, and allow it to flourish, whatever it is you learn.
In any case, don't run from it. and see what the treasure is behind the clouds in some way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Super. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I love being with you.
Likewise.
Don't die.
Yes, may you live long and prosper.
Yes. Yeah, now I get that.
Thank you.